My name is Susan Grace, and until 6 months ago, I would have dismissed anyone who claimed to have experienced consciousness after death. As a neuroscientist with over 20 years of experience studying the human brain, I had always believed that near-death experiences were simply the product of a dying brain, random neural firing creating comforting hallucinations for those approaching death. I was wrong. Not just slightly wrong, but fundamentally, completely, and irrevocably wrong. At 45 years old, I had achieved everything I'd ever wanted in my professional life. I held a prestigious position as the head of consciousness research at the Barrett Institute of Neuroscience, had published numerous peer-reviewed papers on the neural correlates of consciousness, and was considered one of the leading voices in my field. My work focused on understanding how the brain generates consciousness, and I was convinced that consciousness was merely a product of neural activity, nothing more, nothing less. The loss of my father 3 months before my experience had only hardened my materialistic worldview. Watching him waste away from pancreatic cancer, I had seen nothing that suggested consciousness continued after death. When his brain activity ceased, I believed that was it, the end of his existence. I buried myself in my work after his death, avoiding the grief by focusing on our latest research project, mapping the precise neural patterns associated with different states of consciousness. It was during a presentation of this research that everything changed. I still remember every detail of that morning with crystal clarity. The lecture hall was packed with colleagues and students, the air humid from too many bodies in too small a space. The projector hummed quietly as I clicked through my slides, explaining our latest findings on consciousness mapping. I felt a sense of pride as I showed the complex neural networks we'd identified, believing we were getting closer to explaining consciousness entirely through brain activity. And as you can see from these scans, I was saying, pointing to a particularly detailed brain mapping, consciousness appears to be entirely dependent on these specific neural patterns. When these patterns cease. A sudden sharp pain interrupted my sentence, like a bolt of lightning striking through my head. The laser pointer clattered from my hand, and the world tilted sideways. I remember thinking, with scientific detachment that seemed absurd given the circumstances, so this is what a brain aneurysm feels like. Then I was falling, the polished hardwood floor of the lecture platform rushing up to meet me. The last things I registered were gasps from the audience, the sound of running feet, and someone shouting, "Call 911." What happened next defied everything I had believed about consciousness and death. The pain vanished, replaced by a sensation I can only describe as expanding awareness. I found myself floating near the ceiling of the lecture hall, looking down at my own body. My colleagues, Dr. James Chin and Dr. Sarah Martinez, were already performing CPR. James's tie had come loose as he did chest compressions, and Sarah was calling out for the AED that we kept in the hallway. I watched with fascination as my body lay there, my professional black blazer now wrinkled, one shoe had fallen off, and my silver-streaked dark hair spread out on the floor like a fan. My reading glasses had skittered several feet away, one lens cracked from the fall. What struck me most was how peaceful my face looked, despite the chaos surrounding it. As a scientist, I tried to rationalize what I was experiencing. Perhaps this was the last gasp of a dying brain, creating an elaborate hallucination to ease the transition to death. But if that were true, how could I see the details of what was happening behind me without turning? How could I read the time on the clock at the back of the hall? How could I see Professor Williams running in from the 3rd floor with the AED, even though he was out of sight of my physical body? I watched as they attached the AED pads to my chest, heard the mechanical voice announce, "Analyzing heart rhythm, shock advised. Stand clear." I saw my body jerk as the electricity coursed through it, but I felt nothing. According to the medical report I read later, I was clinically dead for 6 minutes and 12 seconds. But those 6 minutes contained an eternity of experience that would forever change my understanding of consciousness, death, and the very nature of reality itself. But before I could fully process what was happening to me, everything shifted. The lecture hall began to fade away, replaced by what seemed like a tunnel of pure consciousness. Unlike the cliché of a white light at the end of a dark tunnel, this was more like moving through layers of awareness, each one expanding my understanding exponentially. The closest analogy I can make is like watching a two-dimensional being suddenly experiencing three dimensions, except I was experiencing dimensions of consciousness I hadn't known existed. And then, in what felt like both an instant and an eternity, I emerged into somewhere else. And there, standing before me with the same gentle smile I remembered from my childhood, was my father. He looked nothing like he had in his final days. Gone was the gaunt, pain-ravaged face and frail body. Instead, he appeared as I remembered him from my youth, tall, strong, with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair. He wore his favorite blue sweater, the one I'd kept after his death but couldn't bring myself to look at. "Hello, Susie," he said, using his old nickname for me. His voice carried the same warm timbre I remembered, but it also seemed to contain dimensions of sound I'd never heard before. "You're a bit early, but I've been waiting for you. There's something you need to see." I struggled to formulate a response, my analytical mind warring with the impossible reality before me. This was the moment when my journey into understanding what the dead are really doing, and the true nature of consciousness itself, truly began. "Dad," I finally managed to say, my scientist's mind still grappling with the impossibility of this encounter. "This can't be real." Neural misfiring during oxygen deprivation could explain. He laughed, the same rich chuckle I remembered from Sunday morning breakfasts and summer barbecues. "Still the scientist, aren't you, Susie? Come with me. I think you'll find your understanding of reality is about to expand considerably." As we moved, though moved isn't quite the right word, as it was more like shifting our awareness, I noticed that we weren't in any place that could be described using physical terms. The space around us seemed to respond to consciousness itself, shifting and changing with our thoughts and intentions. "Where are we?" I asked, trying to find some framework to understand my surroundings. "You might call this the intersection between consciousness and reality," my father replied. "It's where thought and existence merge. But let me show you something that might help you understand." Suddenly, we were in what I can only describe as a vast learning center, though that term barely captures its true nature. The space was filled with what looked like streams of light, but each stream contained information, pure, undiluted knowledge flowing like rivers of consciousness. "This is one of the learning centers," my father explained. "It's where souls come to understand the true nature of existence and their part in it." He gestured to the countless beings around us. I hesitate to call them people, though some appeared in human form while others existed as pure light or patterns of energy. I watched in amazement as souls interacted with these streams of knowledge. Some were reviewing what I realized were their past lives, not just observing but experiencing every moment from multiple perspectives simultaneously. They could feel the impact of their actions on others, understanding the ripple effects of every choice they had made. "Look here," my father said, directing my attention to a particular group. I recognized some of the figures, scientists who had died years ago. To my astonishment, they were continuing their research, but at a level that made their earthly work seem elementary in comparison. "Marie Curie is here often," my father mentioned, noticing my interest. "She's still exploring radiation, but now she understands it at the quantum level and beyond. Many of humanity's scientific breakthroughs actually originate here, filtered down through inspiration to scientists on Earth." This challenged everything I thought I knew about scientific discovery. "You mean?" "Yes," he smiled. "That breakthrough you had last year about neural synchronization. You weren't alone in that insight. Though the work was yours, the inspiration was guided from here." We moved to another area, which my father called the creation workshops. Here, souls worked in what looked like laboratories of pure energy, but unlike anything I'd seen on Earth. They were experimenting with consciousness itself, creating new forms of awareness and testing different configurations of reality. "Watch this," my father said, directing my attention to a group of souls working with what appeared to be patterns of light. As I observed, I realized they were actually designing new ways for consciousness to interact with matter. They're helping to guide the evolution of consciousness itself, not just on Earth but throughout the universe. I saw souls collaborating on projects that bridged the gap between scientific understanding and spiritual truth. Some were working on ways to help humanity understand consciousness as fundamental rather than emergent, while others were developing new frameworks for understanding quantum mechanics that would eventually filter down to earthly scientists. But why? I asked. Why continue scientific work after death? Because understanding never stops, my father explained. Death isn't an end, it's a transition to a broader perspective. Everyone here contributes to the evolution of consciousness in their own way. Some through scientific understanding, others through artistic inspiration, still others through emotional and spiritual growth. He led me to what appeared to be a vast observation area, where souls monitored Earth's progress. I was surprised to see how many were actively involved in guiding and supporting those still living. "Remember last week, when you nearly had a car accident but swerved just in time?" my father asked. "That wasn't just luck. We can't interfere with free will, but we can provide subtle guidance in moments of danger." I watched as souls worked to inspire, protect, and guide their loved ones on Earth. The process was intricate and beautiful, like a cosmic dance of consciousness and free will. They couldn't force any outcomes, but they could create opportunities for growth and understanding. "The biggest misconception," my father said, "is that we just rest in peace. As you can see, we're quite busy. Death is just a different phase of existence, one where we can contribute to life in ways we never could before." I observed souls studying what looked like complex patterns of energy, karmic connections, my father explained. They were learning how to help heal generational trauma, guide technological advancement without overwhelming human free will, and assist in the gradual expansion of human consciousness. "You see, Susie," my father said softly, "your research into consciousness wasn't wrong, exactly. It was just limited. You were studying the interface between consciousness and the physical brain, but consciousness itself is far more fundamental than you imagined. It's not generated by the brain is more like a receiver, tuning into consciousness that already exists." This revelation hit me with the force of scientific epiphany. In that moment, years of research clicked into place, but from an entirely new perspective. I could see how our earthly understanding of consciousness was like trying to understand the ocean by studying the waves on its surface, missing the vast depths below. "There's so much more to show you," my father said, "but I sense our time is growing short." As my father mentioned our time growing short, I felt a subtle pull back toward what I knew must be my physical body. But there was still so much I needed to understand. "You're right about the pull you're feeling," my father said, answering my unspoken thought. "But before you return, there's something crucial you need to see." He guided me to what appeared to be a vast sanctuary filled with healing light. This was different from the learning and creation areas we'd visited. Here, the very atmosphere pulsed with compassion and understanding. "The healing sanctuaries," he explained. "This is where souls come to heal from their earthly traumas and prepare for their next phase of existence." I watched as beings of pure light worked with souls who appeared wounded, not physically, but with visible distortions in their energy fields. "Look," he said, directing my attention to a particular scene. I recognized a woman who had died in my hospital during my residency, a victim of domestic violence. Here, she was working with what appeared to be master healers, gradually releasing the trauma she'd carried. As I watched, her energy field began to clear and strengthen. "The healing that happens here goes beyond anything available on Earth," my father explained. "Every soul eventually finds peace and wholeness, though the process takes what you would consider varying amounts of time. I thought about my own research into trauma and its effects on the brain. So the physical changes we see in trauma survivors' brains are reflections of deeper wounds in consciousness itself, he completed my thought. Your research wasn't wrong, Susie. It just wasn't seeing the whole picture. The brain changes you documented were the physical manifestation of trauma in consciousness. As we watched the healing work continue, I noticed something extraordinary. Each time a soul achieved a measure of healing, ripples of light spread outward, affecting not only that soul but seemingly connecting to others, including, I realized with astonishment, people still living on Earth. Everything is connected, my father said softly. When healing happens here, it creates possibilities for healing everywhere. This is why sometimes, without any obvious reason, people on Earth suddenly find themselves able to overcome long-standing trauma or break free from destructive patterns. He led me to another area where I could see these connections more clearly. It was like looking at an infinite web of light, each intersection representing a soul, each strand a relationship or influence. I could see how every decision, every healing, every understanding gained created ripples through this vast network. This is what your consciousness research was trying to understand, my father said. You were seeing shadows of this reality in your neural network mappings. The brain doesn't generate consciousness, it participates in it. Your work was valuable because it helped people understand that consciousness has patterns and connections, but there's so much more. I thought about my decades of research, seeing it now from this expanded perspective. All those years studying the brain's role in consciousness were not wasted, my father assured me. Humanity needs to understand these things step by step. Your work has been part of building that understanding. But now you'll be able to guide it in new directions. The pull toward my body was getting stronger now, but I had one more crucial question. Dad, why do I have to go back? There's so much more to learn here. He smiled, that same warm smile that had comforted me throughout my childhood. Because you're needed there, Susie. Your understanding of both worlds will help bridge the gap between scientific materialism and spiritual truth. But don't worry, you won't be working alone. He gestured to a group of souls I hadn't noticed before, who seemed to be working specifically with scientists and researchers on Earth. I recognized some of history's greatest scientific minds, but they weren't just resting on their laurels, they were actively working to inspire and guide current research. We'll be helping you, he said. Not by giving you all the answers, that would defeat the purpose of discovery, but by guiding you toward the questions that need to be asked. Your work will help create a framework for understanding consciousness that bridges current scientific knowledge and the greater realities you've seen here. The pull was becoming insistent now, and I could feel myself beginning to fade from this realm. My father held my hands, or rather, our consciousness connected in a way that felt like holding hands. Remember, he said, his voice full of love and wisdom, consciousness isn't produced by the brain, it's fundamental to reality itself. Everything you've seen here can be understood scientifically, just not through the limited framework of materialistic science. You'll help build that new framework. I felt tears that weren't physical tears as I realized our time was ending. Dad, I miss you. I'm always with you, Susie. Remember what you've seen here. Remember that death isn't an end but a transition. Remember that consciousness is infinite and love is the force that connects everything. And remember, your work is more important than you know. The pull became irresistible, and I felt myself being drawn back through layers of awareness. The last thing I heard was my father's voice, "See you in the labs, kiddo. We've got work to do." The return to my body was like being squeezed through a narrow tube of awareness. After the expansiveness I'd experienced, being confined to physical form felt cramped and limiting. I opened my eyes to find myself on the floor of the lecture hall, surrounded by medical equipment and concerned faces. The clock on the wall showed that only 6 minutes had passed since my collapse, but I had experienced what felt like lifetimes of understanding. Dr. Martinez was saying something about a miracle, about how they'd almost given up. But all I could think about was how much work I had to do, how much there was to understand and share. I knew my real work was just beginning, building bridges between the science I'd devoted my life to and the greater realities I'd experienced. 6 months have passed since my near-death experience, and my life has transformed in ways I never could have imagined. The day I returned to work at the Barrett Institute, 2 weeks after my aneurysm, I stood in front of the same lecture hall where I had died. My colleagues expected me to pick up where I'd left off with our consciousness mapping project. Instead, I presented them with a radical new research proposal. What we've been doing, I told them, is like studying a television set to understand the nature of the programs it receives. We've been mapping the hardware without understanding the true nature of the signal. The response was mixed, as I'd expected. Dr. Martinez, who had helped save my life, was cautiously supportive. Others were skeptical, particularly when I proposed new methodologies for studying consciousness that went beyond traditional neuroscience. Dr. Grace, Professor Williams had said, his voice carrying that particular tone of academic concern, "Are you suggesting we abandon empirical research in favor of spiritual exploration?" I smiled, remembering my father's words about bridging gaps. Not at all. I'm suggesting we expand our empirical research to include phenomena we've previously ignored because they didn't fit our materialistic paradigm. Over the following months, I began designing studies that examined consciousness from multiple angles. We started looking at quantum effects in neural microtubules, studying the relationship between consciousness and quantum entanglement, and developing new ways to measure what I now called extended consciousness states. The breakthrough came 3 months ago. Using a combination of advanced EEG mapping, quantum sensors, and new protocols for measuring coherent neural states, we detected patterns that couldn't be explained by traditional neuroscience. The data showed what appeared to be information exchange occurring outside normal spacetime constraints. It's as if consciousness has quantum properties, I explained to my team. It can exist in multiple states simultaneously and appear to transfer information instantaneously across any distance. I didn't tell them that I sometimes sense my father's presence in the lab, guiding us toward particular experimental designs or helping us notice patterns we might have missed. The publication of our initial findings in the Journal of Consciousness Studies created quite a stir in the scientific community. Some dismissed our work outright, but others were intrigued. Researchers from other institutions began reaching out, wanting to replicate our experiments or propose collaborations. But my work wasn't limited to the laboratory. I began speaking with terminal patients at local hospitals, sharing what I'd learned about death and what comes after. Not as religious doctrine or unfounded belief, but as a scientist who had experienced it firsthand. The effect was profound. The brain activity we see during death, I explained to a group of oncology patients, isn't just random firing of dying neurons. It's consciousness transitioning to a different state of existence. Death isn't an end, it's a transformation. I watched hope replace fear in their eyes, saw them relax into their situations with new understanding. One patient, a physicist with late-stage pancreatic cancer, told me, for the first time, "I'm not afraid. It feels like I'm preparing for a fascinating experiment rather than facing an end." My personal life changed too. The driving ambition that had consumed me before was replaced by a deeper sense of purpose. I still worked long hours, but now it was from excitement rather than fear of failure or need for recognition. I knew our work was being guided and supported by what I now called the other side of the lab, those continuing their research beyond physical existence. Sometimes, late at night in my office, I feel my father's presence. Occasionally, I'll notice a particular journal article that seems to appear on my desk at exactly the right moment, or I'll wake up with a solution to a problem we've been struggling with in the lab. I know now that the boundary between life and death is more permeable than we've imagined, and that consciousness flows freely across this supposed barrier. Last week, I gave another lecture in the same hall where I had died. The room was packed, not just with scientists this time, but with doctors, philosophers, religious leaders, and people who had heard about our work and wanted to understand more. "We're standing on the brink of a new understanding," I told them. "Not just of consciousness or of death, but of the very nature of existence itself. Science isn't at odds with spirituality, they're two ways of understanding the same reality. The challenge is to bridge these understandings, to create a framework that honors both the rigorous methodology of science and the expansive nature of consciousness itself." After the lecture, a young neuroscience student approached me. "Dr. Grace," she said, "some people are saying you've gone soft, that you've abandoned real science for speculation." I smiled, remembering how I would have reacted to someone like myself just 6 months ago. "Science is about following the evidence wherever it leads," I told her. "Even when it leads us beyond our comfortable assumptions about reality. The most unscientific thing we can do is ignore evidence simply because it doesn't fit our existing paradigm." As I packed up my materials that evening, I felt that familiar warm presence that I'd come to recognize as my father. "We've got work to do, kiddo," I seemed to hear him say, and I smiled. Indeed we did, work that would bridge worlds, transform understanding, and help people realize that death isn't an end but a doorway to greater understanding. The dead, I now know, aren't gone, they're just working in a different department of the universal laboratory of consciousness. And sometimes, if we pay attention, they send their findings back to us, helping us expand our understanding of the infinite nature of existence itself. My near-death experience may have lasted only 6 minutes by earthly time, but it gave me a lifetime of direction and purpose. Every day, I work to bridge the gap between what we think we know and what actually is, between science and spirit, between life and death. And every day, I'm grateful for that moment when my heart stopped beating, allowing my consciousness to expand beyond the boundaries of what I thought was possible. Because now I know, we're all part of something far greater than we imagine, and death is just another word for transformation.